Um, he's one of the four biggies, the four main, most widely studied and admired Japanese haiku poets. And I have discovered that Kobayashi Isa has a Twitter feed. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Kobayashi Isa is in fact still spreading the Dharma in the form of haiku. And I know his haiku are just haiku and not technically capital D Dharma, but I subscribe to his Twitter feed, and therefore every couple of days I find a haiku in my feed there, an offering from Isa, who is of course long past. And so I want to talk to you about one of those. Today I'm going to use it as a metaphor, and I'm just going to kind of jump off from there. But I like poetry as a starting point for Dharma. It helps me remember that Dharma is at least as much art as it is science or clinical observation, right? So Isa's haiku this morning reads, "Forming billows as well as the others, little cloud." Forming billows as well as the others, little cloud. Isn't that nice? You can look that up online later if you want. Forming billows is what I want to call my talk this morning, after Isa's description of how clouds act, how clouds create themselves. Forming billows as well as the others, little cloud. For those of you who know Isa, you know that he kind of is a famously soft-hearted poet. And so his haiku oftentimes feature his identification with, or his tenderness toward, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the overlooked, the oppressed, the ignored, the small, the vulnerable. He kind of famously sides with underdogs, little spiders behind temple toilets, and the skinny frogs and baby birds, and the wounded children, this kind of thing. So forming billows as well as the others, little cloud. Already we can imagine easily him looking at the entire sky full of billowing clouds, and where does his heart go? Where does his attention go? But to the little one, the little cloud that's forming billows just as well as the others, right? I want to offer one more thing that I think is actually the very same piece of writing in a totally different way. This is why I like poetry, because poetry opens all these doors of imagination and allows all of us to enter, right? Isa's haiku is going to be different for you than it is for me, and your version is just as valid as mine, right? You'd give a very different talk if it was your job to do that today about the very same poem. But I believe this very same thing is expressed by Master Dogen when he says in his famous passage, part of which we used to have on our temple bell at MZMC. Dogen said in Bendowa, he said, "When even one person at one time sits in Zazen, they become imperceptibly one with each and all the myriad things, and permeate completely all time, so that within the limitless universe, throughout past, future, and present, they are performing the eternal and ceaseless work of guiding beings to enlightenment. Only this is not limited to the practice of sitting alone. The sound that issues from the striking of emptiness is an endless and wondrous voice that resounds before and after the fall of the hammer." Whew. A very challenging passage, one of my all-time favorites. I chanted that every day for a long time until I memorized it, because I pulled it up in my heart when I try to remember the significance of one person's zazen. And I normally do that when I'm feeling insecure or vulnerable or hurt in relationship to the power that I imagine is in my zazen. When I kind of wonder, as a lot of us do, does this matter? Does this matter? especially in the face of the times in which we are living? Does my sitting alone in my room and facing the wall, does it matter? And Dogen's radical affirmation, when one person sits zazen, they permeate the entire universe and lead infinite beings to enlightenment. Of course, he's got the heart of a poet. A lot of Dogen's passages steer into poetic imagery and metaphor all the time, but he's also a very, very clear, highly sophisticated critical thinker. And I've always responded to this passage from Dogen as being an expression of what he saw as a literal truth. I don't believe he was trying to write a poem. I believe he was saying something literal about how he understood the Dharma verse, the universe, right? So back to Isa and our little billowing cloud. Forming billows as well as the others. What struck me about this poem was the phrase total dynamic functioning. Dynamic functioning is a phrase we hear in Zen. And I realized a cloud's dynamic functioning is, of course, to billow. That's what clouds do. They're just little pockets, right? Little particles of water vapor that move and respond to air currents, right? And so they take shapes. So from our perspective down here on the ground, we look up and we see shapes and we see them responding to the air around them. And they get larger and they stretch and they change, right? They billow. That's an expansion. That is an increase in capacity. Clouds can also, of course, take on more water and become dense and constrict, and then they release. All that heavy water falls away. All that heavy water falls away, right? And then, of course, as we sit on a beautiful summer day like we are blessed with today here in the Twin Cities, we have the opportunity to watch clouds billow and get larger and stretch and change and expand until, of course, they ultimately disappear, right? Until they return to just becoming the whole sky, right? That's the end game of a cloud, is to ultimately billow and expand until it becomes the whole sky. So in Isa's little poem, Forming Billows as well as the others, you can feel the comparison there, right? And you'd kind of imagine Isa's heart being informed the way it was by Zen, that the comparison would be extra. He wouldn't need to do it. Why would he compare? Why would there be a reason to compare? The reason I like it in this case is because what it makes me do is start to see a pattern. The comparison starts being a tool that I feel he's using to help us see a pattern, because a small cloud will billow exactly as a large cloud does in response to the very same air currents as a large one on the same day at the same time in the same sky, right? He's helping us to see a pattern. And you sort of see how Dogen does the same thing. When one person sits zazen, they become Buddha for the entire universe. The one is compared to the many, and then ultimately the distinction, of course, falls away, right? There aren't two things anymore. There's just the one thing. But in Isa's little poem, Forming Billows as well as the others, little cloud, the comparison helps us to see that the dynamic is the same. So speaking of helpful patterns, I want to talk for just a second about fractals. Fractals, that's Fractals, fractals, is something I am new to exploring the last couple of years. I am not a math person, so I cannot answer any complicated questions about fractals or even simple questions about fractals. But I discovered the term fractal and images of fractals and was fascinated by it because it felt to me, well, I didn't feel it, what it felt exactly like the metaphor that is used throughout the longest sutra in Mahayana Buddhism, the Avatamsaka Sutra. The Avatamsaka Sutra, the Huayan Sutra that so informs the creation of original Zen. It's a Chinese sutra, and anybody who has spent any time reading even small segments of the Avatamsaka Sutra knows it's very much an extension of what Isa is talking about, where the little is the big and the big is inside the little, and both are inside the small, and the small is inside the large, and inside It has passages all throughout it, like inside every atom of every grain of sand on every beach is an infinite number of Buddhas. And underneath each of those Buddhas sits a radiant universe. And underneath that radiant universe is filled with infinite worlds, filled with infinite beaches of infinite sand, each containing infinite molecules. And in each one of those molecules and each one of those atoms is a Buddha shining. And it's that kind of giant holographic view of the universe that some authors now actually call the Buddhaverse, because it's kind of almost a cosmology of everything contained within the one contained in everything. This is very Huayan Buddhist in its thinking. And fractals, the scientific term now that we use, fractals, expresses this very same thing. So a fractal in nature is a term we use to describe a curve or a geometric figure, some sort of patterning, where each part has the same character, the same statistical or pattern creating character as the whole, right? So explaining the idea of a fractal will help explain how like snowflakes form, or how coastlines erode, or how what we normally would think of as a random or partly random or chaotic system, like crystal growth or fluid turbulence in water, how water works, the formation of galaxies, things like that. It helps to explain the pattern and the dynamic of how those things form, right? Now, as I am the host here, I am going to attempt, ta-da, to share my screen with you. Ha! There we go. Can you see my screen? Wonderful. For those of you who are listening, to the podcast or the MP3 of this, I apologize. I encourage you to do an internet search for fractals, and in very short order, you will see images similar to the ones we are all looking at, if not identical ones. We're looking at an image of a triangle that is composed of triangles, that is composed of triangles, that is composed of triangles. And we see the large pattern, and then we see the large pattern repeated small, and then within those, the same pattern, and you get the idea, oh, I get it. This is an infinite regression. I could go in infinitely or out infinitely, and the pattern always remains the same. Spirals within spirals within spirals within spirals. The pattern, no matter how far out you pull in what we call space, or how far in we go in what we call space, the pattern stays the same. The image we're looking at now is perhaps the most helpful, as it is non-abstract. It is the image of a fern. I'm assuming most of us know what a fern is. We can call up that picture in our mind. A fern has a main branch, and then of course, main trunk and branches that go off from there. And then those branches have twigs, and those twigs have leaves. And if we look at them, they all follow exactly the same growth pattern. One big central thing shoots off. From those shoots, one big central thing shoots off. From those, one big central thing shoots off. And you realize I could go infinitely far in or infinitely far out with the same pattern. That's what's called a fractal. Are you starting to see why Isa's little cloud is billowing exactly the same as the big cloud, right? So when people go in with complicated microscopes and watch electron orbits and this kind of stuff, they go all the way into subatomic stuff that I don't even know the names of, and they find patterns that look like galaxies. And then they pull all the way out to the Milky Way and go, oh, hey, that's the same shape. And then they pull all the way out to a cluster of galaxies and go, oh, that's the same shape. And then they pull all the way out using some imagination to super clusters of galaxies. They see the same shape. And they start to go, hold on a minute. This is a recurring pattern. This is a recurring pattern. Isn't that fascinating? So why is that relevant? Here's why I think it's relevant. I promise things will make more sense from here on out. That's a lie. That's not going to happen. What I like about this examination and what I love about what happened to my heart when I discovered this fractal idea of you can go infinitely far in or infinitely far out, right? Or the Avatamsaka. I used to read a chapter of the Avatamsaka Sutra before I went to bed at night because I liked how it made me feel. I didn't understand it, and if you've read it, there's actually not that much there to go into this part of your mind. There isn't that much there for your brain, but there's loads, at least for me, for my heart. And so I'd read these paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. I'm like, I'm not kidding, pages after pages after pages describing Buddhas inside of atoms, inside of Buddhas, inside of atoms, inside of Buddhas, throughout infinite universe full of Buddhas inside of atoms, throughout the universe inside of other atoms, inside of other Buddhas, right? It created a feeling space in me. And one of the things it did that I really appreciated was I realized space is arbitrary. It doesn't exist in any real way. And I imagine a fern as being smaller than me, and a little tiny single leaf on a fern as being even smaller than a fern. And I imagine that this planet and this galaxy are much, much larger than me, and that a supercluster of galaxies is therefore much, much larger than a galaxy. And that's a human scale for space. Of course, it's a human scale for space. Human scale for space, because I'm a human. We are humans. This is how we think of things. What I liked about this fractal idea was it's infinite. It's therefore spaceless. It's arbitrary, whether Buddha, whether all of us imagine ourselves as little clouds, big clouds, infinite. Do you sort of see it? There's this sense that in Zen, a lot of later Zen literature spends a lot of time deconstructing time and deconstructing space. They want to take away space. They want to take away time. Meaning they want to take away our ideas about space. They want to take away our ideas of time. If you've read Dogen, you know that he spends a lot of time with this. Firewood does not become ash. And you think, well, yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. I've seen it happen. When you read fascicles like Uji and Genjo Koan, and he spends time taking away time and taking away space, there's a reason that Zen does that. It sounds very, very trippy. It's very cool to study stuff like fractals and read Avatam Sutra because it takes us to a trippy headspace, and that is awesome. But ultimately, as you know, Zen is Buddhism. And Buddhism cares about suffering. That's actually all it cares about, right? Recognizing suffering, what creates suffering, and how to be in relationship with suffering in such a way we don't create more. That's always the bottom line. It's incredibly practical. Everybody knows this. So why would we be talking about taking away space and taking away time? Because obviously, those constructs at certain points in our practice, at certain points in our perception, cause us suffering. They start to hurt. They start to actually hurt us, right? So space and our ideas about space, at a certain point, and oftentimes, actually, in small, very subtle ways, create pockets of hurting for us. And it's important for us to understand that space is what Dogen would call a rice cake. It does not satisfy. It also does, and we need it because it's a necessary fiction, but please don't remember it is a fiction. So Dogen's painting of a rice cake, pardon me, that's what he said, painting of a rice cake, does not satisfy any more than our ideas about space do. And I think I am big compared to a fern, and the Milky Way is big in comparison to me. And that is useful until it is not. We can see in this little cloud, but my practice is little. But my zazen is little. My billowing is little. Can you feel the part of Isa's heart that is identifying with the small? And he's projecting onto the small the comparison to the large. If only my practice were big. If only my billowing were big. Right? If only my delusion wasn't so big. If only my greed and my hate weren't so big. That feels like a place we've all been. I assume that feels like a place we've all been even yet today, because we all sat zazen together, and because you've been awake for a couple hours now. How many individual instances of comparison or judgment have you made? Probably dozens, because that's the way we tend to perceive the world. I've just created a bigness in another and a smallness in myself. I've just created a goodness in another and a badness in myself. Or I've done the opposite. I've created a goodness in myself. Look at how big my billow is. And I've created a smallness in another. Do you see? There's how suffering is actually created. Right? When we read stuff like, it's good for you to remember Buddha loves everybody you hate. Oh, if I'm honest with myself, I start going, oh, there's a lot of people that I do not welcome into my heart because of my own limitation, right? And yet I aspire, because of my vows, I aspire because of our shared path, to realize the Buddha that I already am. So what am I not including, right? Do you sort of see it? Do you sort of see how some of these comparisons can get in our way and cause us to feed the fuel of self-judgment and close down the Buddha heart? And how sometimes we can understand, oh, the way that I awaken, the little dynamic fractal of my own sitting, my own accepting, my own expanding, my own allowing in a little more, my own moment of compassion, also becomes identification with the whole. Right? Now the comparison falls away. Do you feel the two energies there around this? It's hard to get words to go here. I'm doing my best. So as much as Zen goes out of its way to deconstruct space, it goes out of its way to deconstruct time, again, because at some point we assume that there is, well, we don't assume, we know that there's a connection there between those creations and how we experience the world as suffering. When we take away time, as Buddhism did very, very, very early, we have teachings along the lines of moment. We talk about moment. I'm guessing a lot of you have heard contemporary and traditional Zen teachers talk about moment as an alternative to the moment. When your mind returns to moment instead of the moment. And the dropping of the reminds us, it indicates there is only one moment. So when we're sitting, we oftentimes use kind of clunky language, go, oh, when your mind wanders to the past, when it wanders to the future, notice that that's happened, please, and then return it to the present moment. As if those things were actually real, separate things, right? That the past is a place you could actually wander to, or that the future is a place you could actually wander to. And of course we can't. It's ridiculous, right? And Zen, again, because it's part of Buddhism, does such a great job of saying, well, prove it to yourself. You can experience this right now in your Zazen, or even as you're listening to somebody struggling to convey a complicated idea in a Dharma talk. See if, as we are encouraged to do, see if you can actually find a time that isn't now. See if you can find it. I mean, this whole thing you believe in so strongly, past, find it. Show it to me. See if you can find an experience of past. Even for a second, see if you can find an experience of past. See if you can find this other thing you so believe in, future. This thing later. This thing tomorrow. Show it to me. No one's ever experienced it. Not in the history of the universe has anybody ever experienced later. So show me 5 minutes from now. Show me 30 seconds from now. Show me 2 breaths from now. A taste, a sense, a smell, an idea, a thought, anything. And we start to investigate and realize, oh, I can't. I can experience memory now. I can experience anticipation now. I can experience emotions in relations to those ideas now, but I never leave now. I never leave it. There is no time. There's like literally no time. In our liturgy, in the service that we do, in Zen, we say this, no space, no time, this way. We say all Buddhas, 10 directions, 3 times. All Buddhas, the infinite everythingness of everything. That's every cell, every molecule, every atom, every galaxy, every cloud, everything. All Buddhas. 10 directions is infinite space, so that there is no space, because it's 10 directions. There's no space. It's infinite everywhereness. It's that the idea of the fractal taken all the way in and all the way out. There's just no space now, because it's up and down, and all the 8 cardinal compass points, right? That's the 10 directions. All of space, which now means nothing because it's infinite, right? So we don't get to have a big, we don't get to have a small. And then when we say 3 times, the 3 times, all of past, all of present, all of future, again, pointing only to now. The only time we can experience these things is now. We've just taken away all of it. Wow, we've taken away all of it. But you also see the expansion here that happens when we take away the idea of it, which is why Zen does this, which is why Dogen does this, which is why Issa, I imagine in my head, about his little poem, does this. When you let go of the idea of space, when you let go of the idea of time, you're letting go of a self-imposed idea about your limits. You've suddenly stopped being finite. You don't have edges now. Does that make sense? If there isn't space, it's spaceless. You pervade all of it, just like Dogen said. If there's no time, then it's timeless. And your practice immediately encompasses all of the past, present, and future. How could it not? There's no more barriers anymore to keep it in. The fractal of Zazen, the little cloud that we all are, sitting and billowing on its zafu for a half an hour, for 20 minutes, for 2 minutes, is exactly identified with the giant, with the large, with the cloud, with all clouds, with every sky. How could it not be? Right? There is no space to limit it, and there isn't time to limit it. There's only expansion. That's why Zen wants us to do this so bad. They want our gaze and our investigation of these ideas, a lot of other ones too, but time and space for today's purview, to be very close and very careful. You know, Dogen always says, investigate this thoroughly. Look at this thing you call time. Find it, prove it, see it, taste it. Can you? Can you? Can you? I mean, come on, show me this yesterday. Show me this tomorrow. Show me this later. Show me this space. Show me big. Show me small. You can't. And it's so important that we do that for ourselves in the experience of our own body, in the experience of our own breath, in the experience of our own bones and muscles, so we can feel it in ourselves. We watch time and space dissolve under our gaze. We watch it happen, right? Why? Because then our ideas about Buddha starts to disappear, right? Our ideas about Zen start to disappear. We don't need to keep seeking and grasping and grabbing. We don't need to keep hoping that the thing that's about to happen that we imagine is in the future is going to be better than this thing. I know you can all feel, because you're here at a Zen talk, you can all feel the amount of thirst you have all the time. We all have the amount of hunger, grasping, constriction, dukkha, right? The first noble truth. This is where we all start. We feel that. And one of the ways we rub up against ourselves and continue to create dukkha is all these ideas that we have about our bigness and our smallness and about later being better than now. When instead, we investigate these ideas all the way down, just like the fractal, we discover boundarylessness. This is not about having a trippy experience on the cushion at all. It's much more practical than that. It's about seeing the pattern. Do you see the pattern, right? So in Busho's Zazen, for example, if Busho is sitting and he experiences his body as being connected to his zabuton, he feels the stability of the earth underneath his knees and his seat on his zafu there. He can feel the uprightness of his spine. Here's a fractal of Buddha. There's a million, trillion, zillion littler Buddhas inside of me and a million, trillion Buddhas that are bigger outside of me. But I'm starting to get a sense of being part of something large. I'm creating for myself a container that can hold what I'm going to investigate, which is suffering, always. And then when those little moments come up, memories about yesterday that hurt, fear about tomorrow that hurt, right? Self-criticism, shame, doubt, confusion. I have a space in which I can hold them. I don't feel constricted anymore. I don't feel claustrophobic or trapped anymore by those experiences. And I've come to understand something that's really important, that when those little emotions show up and I say yes, I include them, just the way the sky includes all those little clouds, and say yes to them and am courageous enough to hold them and allow them to be, which is our instruction in Zazen, right? We experience it. What you hear, what you see, what you feel, right? When you're having a deep breath, you know it's a deep breath. When you're having a moment of sadness, you know you're having it, right? Intimacy with experience, trust in experience. And I soften that pain just a little, even for a few seconds, by going, I see you. I acknowledge that you're there. I don't have to run from you. I don't need to compare this moment to any other moment. And I don't need to even imagine a future in which you're not here. This can be enough. I see you. Do you feel how that's self-fulfilling? I'm not in a relationship with past or future. I'm not needing anything to be there that doesn't need to be there. I'm not wishing anything be gone that I don't want to be there. This is what Dogen was talking about. This is the activity of Buddha. I meet suffering with compassion, and I meet unconsciousness with truth, right? Or wisdom, compassion and wisdom. This moment, one moment of meeting a falsehood with truth, meeting pain or suffering with compassion is the activity of Buddha. There's the fractal. There's that little cloud, the little cloud that I call Busho, being exactly the same as the big cloud, being exactly the same as all Buddha's 10 directions 3 times. I've blown the doors off of the size of the project so that this moment of just tenderness, this moment of just compassion, this moment of truth recognition that we call wisdom becomes everything. So then Dogen's passage about permeating all space and all time with one person's zazen, even for a minute, he says, when they sit with even one person's zazen for even a minute does this, right? I realize the literalness of that. Does that make sense? I realize the literalness of that and realize, oh, I live in my imagination. The rest of the time when I'm imagining that I'm separate and I'm small and somebody else's zazen must be bigger than mine and somebody else's Zen center must be larger than ours and somebody else's practice must be, and the suffering is so big and I can't get to all of it because I'm just a little cloud. Do you feel how those delusions start to fall away? We start to see the limitlessness. And you see right away the effect that has immediately on the experience of momentary suffering. This sounds really abstract, what I'm trying to describe today to you, but it's the opposite. Once you see the pattern, you see it. We see the fractal patterns in how we create suffering. We see the fractal patterns in how we create freedom, right? We start to just see it. Wow. All right. So I'm going to wrap up here in just a minute, but I want to remind us all, just because this is such an abiding idea, this is such, even in Buddhist communities, it is such an abiding idea that practice, meditation, the Zen path, whatever word you want to put on it, is designed to make us less human. We see this all of the time. It is one of the most abiding misunderstandings about what it is we are brave enough to do, and we see it all the time. That somehow the goal is to feel less, right? That somehow the goal is to get triggered less, to be activated less. No, that is not what we are doing. Buddhism from the very, very inception, and Zen especially, is earth affirming, human affirming. This is the Mahayana path. This is the relationship with suffering described by the Bodhisattva vows. We're not here to end anything. It is our connection to the earth, our connection to our humanity, our shared humanity. That is our strength. The idea in the Bodhisattva ideal of recognizing the Buddha nature spirit part of you, returning over and over to the red dust human part of you, over and over out of infinite compassion. That's the central myth of the entire thing we call Mahayana Buddhism. And do you feel the motion? It's a returning, it's an affirmation. It's always an inclusion. Always, I'm coming back for you, I'm coming back for you. We leave nothing behind, right? So when that shows up in you, that moment of sadness, fear, doubt, shame, confusion, whatever the affliction is, dukkha, when dukkha shows up, this is our project, right? When dukkha shows up, my goal isn't to someday not have that show up or to be in a relationship with that where I don't feel it, don't see it, don't know about it, where I'm so bulletproof and so defended that I don't have the human experience anymore. That's the opposite of the Bodhisattva vow. And yet we see it. So this fractal idea, this Isa poem, this Dogen poem is just one more maybe awkward way of a Zen teacher trying to encourage you. Your ability, your innate birthright as consciousness in form is you get to get bigger. You get to billow because you're human, not because you're Buddhist, but because you're human. And you're wise enough to have chosen to expose yourself to a path that is entirely about how do I make this space that we call heart-mind, this inner space, so big that it includes everything in the outside. How do I do that? Can I get bigger? Can I get larger? Can I hold more? Of course, my billowing is exactly the same as the big. I am the big. So when my little constriction shows up, how do I breathe just a little bit of space into it? And I trust that that moment of expansion, that moment of compassion, that moment of truth-telling and wisdom is the dynamic functioning of all of us. That's it. That's the thing. There's the Bodhisattva vow. Perfectly expressed, perfectly met, right? It's such an important thing. It's such an important thing for all of us. So I'm encouraging you today, if there's only one takeaway, continue to do a little cloud practice, right? Just like Isa. Have yourself be moved. Let yourself be moved by the little. We all tend to identify more readily with the little because of our dukkha, right? Because of our dukkha. Recognize, please, even if this is an expression of your faith, that your little cloud practice, your little moments being met with compassion and wisdom is the big, it is the dynamic functioning of Buddha. And that little moment that you've spent being that much kinder, that much clearer with one moment of your experience has permeated everything. Even if you haven't experienced it, even if you can't fit the metaphor inside of your head, take it on faith. Take it on faith. This is the central tenet of Mahayana Buddhism. Zazen matters. It fills the universe when we do it. It matters, it matters, it matters. Say yes to being with your suffering, and you've been with the suffering of all beings. Wow. Can you imagine the thing we're all so hungry for, just to be met with acceptance, love, wisdom, the thing we all crave more than any other thing, to actually get a chance to be that for even a few minutes? Oh, wow, what an invitation. What an invitation. And that's my invitation, and it's not mine. It's the invitation I inherited from my teachers and their teachers and all the Dogans and all the Isas and all the clouds. So there you go. That's as much as I think I need to say to you. And I thank you. I thank you for your attention today.